Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, well, thank you for giving us a shot. What we do here on the Varietal Literature YouTube page is we make a cozy little corner of the internet for narrative. And what we're doing here specifically today is we are going to read some spooky folklore. And that is, of course, because we are in October and we're doing our Hallowstreams for folklore. And tonight we are specifically going to share some short stories, some very brief little snippets of the Slavic traditional folklore character, the Noonwraith, which is made most famous by the Witcher games. I'm going to say more on that in a moment, but if you are not watching this live, you have a great benefit of being able to go down to the description below and click on whatever timestamp interests you the most. We're going to be reading several stories tonight. The first few are Noonwraith stories. They are very short little snippets, unfortunately. And then after that, I'm going to read some stories that kind of didn't really fit into any of the other streams this month. But I still wanted to read, including a fun one at the end that's a little more lighthearted after some of the grim stuff that we will be encountering. So if you're not watching this live, click on those timestamps below in case you are, just want to get to whatever it is you're interested in. But if you are watching this live, the benefit that you have is that you can join us in the live chat where a little crop of potatoes has already grown up. And I see there Lizzie Rose, GS Jump Store, Tammy Morelli. Very good to see you folks. We had a bit of a quiet Thursday and we missed you folks. Though I think we still had a good time. Yeah, I'm glad to hear you're at least one surgery down, Tammy. Let's hope the next one goes smooth and then you can move on with your life. All right. Well, I don't want to waste too much time because I actually have a decent amount of stories to get through and I'm not 100% how long it's all going to take together. But of course, it's that time of the day you have some Zevia. Zevia. You thought you bought Pop, but instead you bought Zevia. Oh well. Anyways. Let me get to a little bit of description, because this one definitely merits some description. The Noonwraith. The Noonwraith is a pretty unique spirit in that it has all the characteristics of like a haunting spirit that comes out of the grave, but it explicitly is a daytime thing. And that's not completely unheard of in folklore, but it's pretty rare. And we'll get a little bit of a feel for it from here, but there's a little bit I need to say on it first. And the first thing I will say is that the Noonwraith is a spirit from Slavic folklore made most famous in modern times, at any rate, by the Witcher 3 video game, as it is the first serious contract you have to do. I guess depending on how you look at the hippogriff or whatever it was called. Anyways, it's possible they make an appearance in the Witcher stories, like the books, but I don't recall seeing them there. Though I haven't read everything Sapkowski wrote in the series, nor is my memory all that reliable. But I don't recall the Noonwraith coming up there. But it isn't a spirit that would be out of place in the Witcher stories anyways, because Sapkowski based much of the Witcher series on the folklore of his home country, Poland, which is a Slavic country, or at least a country largely Slavic in origin. And the Noonwraith being a Slavic folklore creature fits the bill for the kind of thing that the Witcher encounters. So the question then is, why are we discussing it in a collection of German folklore? And that's because these specific tales we're going to read tonight trace back to the Wendish people that occupied the northeast regions of what we would now call Germany. In other words, and this is the extremely abridged version of this, German history is really complicated, and the borders of culture in general in Europe and all over the world are always fuzzy. They mingle and mix, and you find it in tales and stories and versions of things in all places. So, to me, that made these accounts a bit unique. There are other accounts of the Noonwraith out there, but these ones were interesting to me because they were sort of on that German-Slavic border. And that's why I've chosen to read them here today. Anyways, that said, after these short Noonwraith stories, we are going to read a few stories that never quite found a home in a stream this month, but I still wanted to read, including a fairly gruesome and frankly grounded tale of murder. It's barely folklore. It's mostly just a salacious story of horrible murder. An odd Icelandic tale that I don't really know if it counts as horror or anything. It's kind of strange, and I liked it. About a skeleton in a church. And finally, we're going to end on a bit of a longer Scottish tale that's kind of lighthearted. I'm calling it my folkloric version of the Monster Mash song about witches that go out and throw rad parties. So that's what we're on the roster tonight. And since I have it on my mind about like the plans for this month, I will say I this week will be reading the recommendation I got, The Parasite by Arthur Conan Doyle. I will say that there is another Sheridan Le Fanu story that I'm also interested in reading, and I don't know. I'm going to read them both this week and see which one vibes the best with the stuff we've done this month. And which ones I feel like I can do the most justice to. But I do believe at least one of those, one of those will be read on Tuesday, which means that next week should be our longer stream that we did. We did for the first time last year, and it was reasonably well received, where we read the entirety of Carmilla for 4.5 hours live. I'm hoping not to do it that long again, so I'm trying to find shorter tales. Both of these seem to be shorter. All right. That's sort of the state of the land for Fireside Fairytales. Zombie Wolf says, I'm positive no matter how gruesome it is, it won't top the unnecessary grotesqueness of any episode of Hannibal. I contest that it's unnecessary. I think that's what Hannibal was about, but I really like that series, and I'm not even a huge horror fan. I really like the Hannibal series. I think we've discussed this. Lizzie Rose did not like the Parasite story. Well, we'll see. We'll see how I feel about it. My experience with Arthur Conan Doyle is that it doesn't always work very well with spoken storytelling, so I'll see how I feel about it. But I'm going to read it anyways because the concept is interesting. But we've been doing a lot of ghosts this month, and the other one's the Sheridan Le Fanu story is a ghost story. So I don't know. Zombie Wolf says, Rory took my suggestion. I have not committed to taking the suggestion. I am saying I'm going to read it for myself and see. When I've read Arthur Conan Doyle's horror stuff before, he does that thing that was really popular around that time in weird fiction where it's like two men sitting in an office talking for like 15 pages. I don't want to do that, so I'm hoping it's not that. Lizzie Rose says it's icky. It is icky. The concept, I read the summary of it. It's icky. So we'll see. We'll see. What I will say is that I do kind of have to think of the Hallowstreams on a yearly cycle. So if I don't end up reading it this time, there's a good chance I'll read it next year. Because the story that I'm thinking of from Sheridan Le Fanu is a story I was thinking of last year for Sheridan Le Fanu, and I decided to instead to go with his other story, Carmilla. Anyways, that's enough blabbing from me. All right. Our first three very short stories, they're three little snippets from different collections, concern the Noonwraith. which is a daytime haunt, if you will, from Slavic traditions. So oddly enough, there won't be any like dark and eerie sounds because, of course, without a field. Also, let me know if the sound mix is off. Our first story tonight is called The Noon Woman. Připolniza. Probably not doing that justice. I'm going to try and skip over some of the... I have a hard time with Slavic pronunciation. I apologize. And it comes to us from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, a collection of German folklore, although in this case Wendish folklore, from Jürgen Hubert, who you can support on his Patreon, who I should have pinned down below if you are not watching this live. Sorry, a little bit of an issue there. The Noon Woman is a female, tall, white-clad entity who tends to appear on the fields around noon, 12 to 2 o'clock. This Noon Woman roamed over the fields with a sickle in her hand and suddenly stopped before those who had neglected to stop the field work and go home at noon. The people who had been surprised in this manner then had to pass a rigorous interrogation about the cultivation of flax and the weaving of linen. And they had to speak about these topics so exhaustively that they could fill the time until 2 o'clock with it. Once this hour struck, she lost her power and went away, but the terrified people were unable to answer her question and failed to maintain the conversation until this hour. She cut off their head, or strangled them, or at least gave them a disease which involved terrible headaches. Which I think one of those is much better than the others. Those who are capable of saying the Lord's Prayer backwards without any mistake would be able to save themselves in this manner as well. People were also safe from her if the sky was overcast or if a storm was approaching. It is still custom to jokingly tell those who work on the field at noon without need, "Aren't you afraid that the Noon Woman will come for you?" And the common saying that she asks questions like the Noon Woman is frequently heard in the spinning chamber. And we've talked about the spinning chamber before, but it's where wool is made back in the day. Out of, like, not wool specifically, but like flax and linen. Thread, cloth. Thread is wound and cloth is made from it. And then it goes on with some footnotes that I'll add in here because, after all, we're learning a bit about them. The legend of the Russians is almost identical, which isn't too surprising because there's a lot of Slavic influence in Russia as well. Russians will throw themselves on the ground if the spirit approaches. If they don't do so, the spirit will break their arms and legs. However, there is a holy tree which always grows in the area where the Noon Woman appears, whose bark appears to heal inner injuries. The Připolniza is likely a kobold-like. Keeping in mind that kobold is a fairly general term in German, we did look at a very specific collection of kobolds, but kobold is sort of trickster spirits in general, and can be used pretty generally as well. The personification of the goddess Mara, who likewise roams during the bright hours of noon, and she embodies the dual nature of this goddess, but represents this in a peculiar manner as the protector of flax cultivation and as the personification of heat stroke, which is really what this is about, by the way. In many ways, it's about trying to explain, the weird events that occur from exposure in the middle of the day, like heat stroke. Carrying on, she's a Wendish Sphinx, a double symbol of wisdom and death. She questions and interrogates people to their deaths, similar to the Boeotian Sphinx of Oedipus. Boeotian? And then it goes on and gives some other names for it. If you're interested in those footnotes, you can certainly reach out to support the Patreon and get the book yourself. So there we get the first iterations of the Noonwraith, and they really are fairly consistent. As we will see. I'm just going to sort of carry on here. They are pretty consistent in how they present their... the Noonwraith. She is a woman who appears around the field in the midday. In the Witcher series, they say that they are wronged women, and that, you have to resolve what was wronged about them, and then that'll get rid of them. But there really isn't much to indicate that in at least the Wendish traditions here. And it is entirely, because that's kind of the story for a lot of the monsters in The Witcher, and it is entirely possible that is more just because it is convenient for storytelling purposes. The next tale is called The Noon Woman Near Kosel. It's very short. Also comes to us from Jürgen Hubert's Sunken Castles Evil Poodles, who you can support at the pinned comment below. A cross used to stand on a field near Kosel. The people of Kosel erected it as a memorial and as a warning. Once a farmer woman stayed behind on the field at noon with her child, and no one else was around. Then the Noon Woman appeared and started to question her. However, the woman did not reply, but in her terror took her child on the arm and tried to get away, and then the Noon Woman twisted her neck so that she fell dead to the ground together with her child. So we see again the same thing, right? She shows up in the field at noon. She interrogates people, and you want to try to answer these questions, or she kills you. Or apparently either can give you migraines or heat stroke. All right. Our last account, also a brief one, of the Noonwraith is the Pschiponza, which also comes to us from Sunken Castles Evil Poodles by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support at the pinned comment below. Pschiponza is a noon spectre, a tall female figure who floats above the hot grain fields during the heat of noon of the harvest time. At other times, she rushes women who stay outside during these times with their infants or fall asleep, plagues them with horrible dreams, or otherwise harasses them. Pschiponza was repeatedly noticed in the Georgenburg area, in the Tarnowitz district. She walks up and down on a field or a meadow. She lifts her apron with her left hand and frequently picks something up with her right hand, puts it in her apron. She has a red cloth on her head, which has been folded 3 times, and her clothes are short and many-colored. When she is done tormenting people who cross her path with 1,000 questions, they are paralyzed or killed if they fail to answer even a single one. Then she vanishes beneath a large rock like a shadow. The cattle fear the Noon Woman as well. If it sees her, they remain rigidly standing where they are and refuse to move from their spot. Giese says, well, how are you supposed to work in the fields then? Well, it's pretty straightforward. You don't work from noon to 2. Jurgen makes this observation, but I think anybody probably could. There's a pretty convenient reason for this myth to exist. To try and tell your boss that you can't work from noon to 2. You know, you don't want us to get killed, do you? The Noonwraith is out there. The Noonwraith is such a unique thing to me because it, like I said, you know, how often do you really hear about stuff being in the midday? You know, spooks and things like this being in the midday. This is really unusual. Full stop. It's an unusual thing to see. Okay. Just pull the next one up. Gia says, this Noon Woman blows my mind. It's a very unusual one, isn't it? I wish I had more of this sort of rendition of her there. I find it interesting that the other thing she does, which isn't super common with spirits and ghosts, is she talks too much, right? Like normally they come at night and they barely say anything and they're hard to discern. But here's this big tall woman who haunts around in the broad daylight, especially on sunny days, and then harasses you with questions about flags. It's a very strange tradition, but it's very obviously there to help people who wanted to take a break, man. You frozen on me or something? What are you doing? This is not where I need to be. Okay. Lizzie Rose says, yeah, it is highly unusual that this happens during the day. It really is. Because it's kind of like, what is the plausible deniability here? You just missed it? Like, are you going to say that every time? Anyways. I think it's very obviously a story to get people a break. Yeah, that's right. Giese says early union recruiter. Maybe Pumpet brought him over. Isn't Pumpet Slavic as well? No, I can't remember. Maybe that's it. All right. Okay, folks, I need your attention for a moment. Because I need to make sure this is heard. Our next tale is called The Murderer Giese. It comes with a content warning that you should heed. This is a tale of domestic murder, and it is gruesome in that. It's not about the Noonwraith. This is one of the tales that didn't really fit into any other stream, so I'm reading it here. It is more grounded than normal. It's not campy or whatever. It's gruesome domestic murder. So if that's something that's triggering to you, it's probably about 3 or 4 minutes of story. Maybe a little longer. Maybe mute or something, or come back later. Or if you're watching this as the VOD, click on the stream links below and go to the next story, which is not this dark. On Palm Sunday evening in 1527, a woman who lived on the lower parts of the Jerusalemberg by the way, seems to have been named as for being at the end of I've lost the term for it, where you march around to various churches in Europe. Not for any other reason. Walked home from Lübeck with a keg of beer. She was one of few means, but managed her money frugally, even if she did not always succeed. Her husband was a drunkard, and nobody knew why. But as the poor woman came home, he started berating her and beating her. Severely injured at the neck, she jumped outside to seek help, but when she fell into the ditch, he jumped on her and beat her to death. How he subsequently mistreated her is unspeakable, and anything like this has not happened since Lübeck was founded. Suffice to say that the remains of an unborn child were found with him, which he had intended to use for witchcraft. After the deed was done, he calmly packed his belongings, left the corpse lying on the ground, and left the area. But as soon as the body was found, rage and disgust gripped the entire city. Whoever was able to move scattered into all direction by horse and by foot. And finally, the perpetrator was found in his possessions in a boat to Herendijk, where he wanted to be ferried over to the Mecklenburgian side by a local boy. At 2 p.m. in the afternoon, he was already brought to the Marstall, to the gruesomely mutilated body, but he simply said shamelessly, Look, poor woman, I didn't expect to see you this way when I sent you into town yesterday." But in this moment, the body started to bleed heavily, and so the noble lords and the people were amazed and saw this as God's finger pointing at the guilty party. The murderer was thus brought to the court usher's house, but due to the rage of the population, and especially the woman, it was difficult to get him there alive. Indeed, as he was brought before the house, the court usher's wife stepped to the door in rage and shouted, "Begone with that rogue! I don't want him to put a single step into my home!" But Klaus Rose replied, calm down, dear woman. I will lock him up safely so that you can retain what God has given you." And with these words, he put him into the deepest cellar. After Easter, the monster was broken on the wheel, beheaded and quartered. His head, however, was put on a tall stake. Lizzie Rose says he just leaves the body. That's cold. Indeed, it is. Especially for that time where leaving bodies unburied was like damning them to wander the earth. It's a brutal story. It's so brutal, I kind of believe it. Obviously, the supernatural element here is the body bleeds to testify beyond death who did it to her. Which is a thing, frankly, there are tons of stories about this. There's stories in Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles about these sort of omens, but there are stories like this throughout folklore where the bodies, in some way or another, from as dramatic things as like sit up and point to just bleed in their presence, like this one comes up a lot. Yeah. That's one of the more brutal ones we have had to deal with on this show. But I suppose at least he got what's coming to him. Okay, now we go into some more light-hearted things. Still on the, the atmospheric side, I guess, but a little less explicitly gruesome. Our next tale comes to us from Icelandic Legends by Jan Arnesson. And this one is called The Skeleton in Holar Church. And it's an eerie story, but it's more odd than scary or whatever. And I just never quite knew where to fit it, and I still wanted to read it. Once, on a winter evening, it happened that Jan Arnesson, Bishop of Holar, wanted a book which he had left lying on the altar in the church. So he called his household folk together and asked which of them would do him the favor of fetching the book for him. Well, they all shuddered at the idea and all drew back, except one maid-servant who declared herself quite willing to go and not in the least afraid. Now the bishop, having enemies, as who has not, had made a tunnel from his own house, which was called the Palace, underground to the church, with a view to being able, if need should ever be, to take sanctuary at a moment's notice and unobserved. Through this tunnel the maid went, having procured the keys of the church. But when she had taken the book from the altar, she determined not to go back through the tunnel, which she'd found dismal and ghostly, but rather round the other way. So she walked down the church with the keys to the outer door, and looking towards the benches where the women were wont to sit, she saw there a human skeleton with long yellow hair. Amazed at this, but perhaps more amazingly in no way frightened for some reason, she went up to the figure and said, "Who are you?" Upon which the skeleton said, "I am a woman, and I have long been dead. But my mother cursed me so that I can never corrupt." Decay, in other words. Not, like, morally. "And return to the dust whence I sprung. Now, therefore, my good girl, I entreat you to release me from this ban, if it lies in your power." "But," answered the girl, "it does not lie in my power as far as I know. Tell me how I can help you." Then the skeleton replied, "You must ask my mother to forgive me my faults and to annul her curse, for she may very likely do for the living what she refuses to do for the dead. It is a rare thing indeed for the living to ask favors of the dead." "Where is your mother, then?" asked the maiden. "Oh," said the other, "she is here, there, and everywhere. Now, she is yonder in the choir." And then the maiden went through the door into the choir and saw sitting there on one of the benches a wondrous, ugly old woman in a red hat, to whom she addressed herself, asking her to be good enough to forgive her daughter and remove her the curse. And after pausing a while, plainly unwilling, the old hag answered, "Well, if it is not often that you living people ask favors of me, so for once I will say to you, yea." Having thanked her for her goodness, the maiden went back towards the outer door, but when she came to the place where she'd seen the skeleton, she found there only a heap of dust. So she went on towards the door, and as she opened it, she heard a voice from the inner part of the church which cried after her, "Look at my red eyes! How red they are!" And without looking around, she answered, "Look at my black back and how black it is." And as soon as she'd shut the door behind her, she found that the churchyard seemed to swarm with people who were shouting and screaming direfully, and who made as if they would stop her. But she, summoning up the courage, rushed through the middle of them without looking either to the right or the left, and reached the home building in safety. And as she delivered the book back to the bishop, she said, "So loud were the voices of the goblin band that 5 echoes for each were found in the mountain rocks, though far they stand from Holar burying ground." And that's the end of that story. What is that story about? Jump store. I get along well with my mother, but I definitely had the thought, because I have a lot of friends who don't, who'd be like, this would be the worst horror story of all time, where you had to actually get your mother to approve of you. The real horror. Familial approval. All right. Jump store says true, Rory. Hashtag relatable. Now this is a tale about Scotland, so it's got to have some rain. All right. Now this is the longest story we're reading tonight, but it is also the last story we're reading tonight. It is also the least gruesome. It comes with no content warnings. It is just in the sort of theming of Halloween, because it's about a bunch of witches and monsters and things. But it's mostly a silly, fun thing. Given that so many of the stories that I've read this month have been, I think, a level more than normal, even for other Hallowstreams and their grotesque brutality and so on. I guess I just wanted something a little more campy fun. So this is called The Witch of Fife, and it comes to us from the Scottish Fairy Book. It is just a fun story about a group of party witches. In the kingdom of Fife, in the days of long ago, there lived an old man and his wife. The old man was a douce, quiet body, but the old woman was lightsome, flighty. Some of the neighbors were wont to look at her askance and whisper to each other that they sorely feared that she was a witch. And her husband was afraid of it too, for she had a curious habit of disappearing in the gloaming and staying out all night. And when she returned in the morning, she looked quite white and tired, as if she'd been traveling far or working hard. He used to try and watch her carefully, in order to find out where she went or what she did, but he never managed to do so, for she always slipped out of the door when he was not looking. Before he could reach it to follow her, she'd vanished utterly. At last, one day, when he could stand the uncertainty no longer, he asked her to tell him straight out whether she were rich or no. And his blood ran cold when, without the slightest hesitation, she answered that she was. And if he would promise not to let anyone know, the next time she went on one of her midnight expeditions, she would tell him all about it. The goodman promised, for it seemed to him just as well that he should know all about his wife's cantrips. Let me pause here, because if you, like me, only know the term cantrip from D&D, you might be a little confused. Cantrip is apparently a Scottish word, which is about... it has a few different uses, but the one that's being applied here is a tricky spell. Tricky as in, like, not hard to do, but, like, it's a trickster spell. And it was associated very much with witches. He had not long to wait before he heard of them. For the very next week the moon was new, which is, as everybody knows, the time of all others when witches like to stir abroad. And on the first night of the new moon, his wife again vanished. Nor did she return till daybreak the next morning. And when he asked her where she'd been, she told him this time, and in great glee, how she and 4 like-minded companions had met at the old kirk on the moor, and had mounted branches of green bay tree and stalks of hemlock, which had instantly changed into horses, and how they had ridden swift as the wind over the country and hunting the foxes and the weasels and the owls, and how at last they'd swam the Forth and come to the top of Bel Amand, and how there they'd dismounted from their horses and drunk beer that had been brewed in no earthly brewery, and out of horn cups that had been fashioned by no mortal hands. And how after that a wee man had jumped up from under a great mossy stone with a tiny set of bagpipes under his arm, and how he had piped such wonderful music that at the sound of it the very trouts jumped out of the loch below, and the stoats crept out of their holes, little like rodents, and the corby crows and the herons came and sat on the trees in the darkness to listen, and how all the witches danced until they were so weary that when the time came for them to mount their steeds again, they'd be home before the cock crowed. They could scarce sit on them for fatigue. There they are, flying about. The goodman listened to this story in silence, shaking his head meanwhile, and when it was finished, all that he'd answered was, "And what the better are you for all your dancing? You'd have been more comfortable at home." Which, by the way, is the most Scottish man thing that any of these stories has ever said. Specifically a Scottish husband. Why did you go out? It's easier to sit on your butt at home. Pretty sure my dad has literally said that. At the next new moon, the old wife went off again for the night. And when she returned in the morning, she told her husband how, on this occasion, she and her friends had taken cockle shells for boats, and they had sailed away over the stormy seas. till they reached Norway. And there they'd mounted invisible horses of the wind and had ridden over mountains and glens and glaciers till they reached the land of the Laps, lying under its mantle of snow. And here all the elves and fairies and mermaids of the north were holding festival with the warlocks and the brownies and pixies, and even the phantom hunters themselves who were never looked upon by mortal eyes. And the witches from Fife held a festival with them, and danced and feasted and sang with them. What was of more consequence, though, was they learned from them certain wonderful words, which, when they uttered them, would bear them through the air, and would undo all bolts and bars, and so gain them admittance to any place soever where they wanted to be. And after that they had come home again, delighted with the knowledge which they had acquired. "What took you to siccan a land as that?" asked the old man with a contemptuous grunt. "You would have been a sight warmer in your bed." Again, just incredibly Scottish. You would have been warmer in your bed. You went off. You went off and met the wonders of the Fey world and had a party in Norway. But it's so cold. What about your feet? They get cold without it. Socks and a fire. But when his wife returned from her next adventure, he showed a little more interest in her doings. For she told him how she and her friends had met in the cottage of one of their number, and how, having heard that the Lord Bishop of the Carlisle had some very rare wine cellar, they'd placed their feet on the crook from which the pot hung, had pronounced the magic words which they'd learned from the elves of Lapland, and lo and behold, they flew up the chimney like whiffs of smoke, and sailed through the air like little wreaths of cloud. In less time than it takes to tell, they landed at the bishop's palace at Carlisle. And the bolts and bars flew loose before them, as was promised. And they went down to his cellar and sampled his wine, and were back in Fife fine, sober, old woman by cock crow. Well, when he heard this, the old man started from his chair in right earnest, for he loved good wine above all things, and it was but seldom that it came his way. "By my troth, but thou art a wife to be proud of," he cried. "Tell me their words, woman. I'll even go and sample this lordship's wine for myself." But the good wife shook her head. Nah, I cannot do that," she said. "For if I did, and you telled it over again, 'twould turn the whole world upside down, for everybody be leaving their own lawful work, and flying about the world after other folks' business, and other folks' dainties. So just bide content, goodman. You get on fine with the knowledge you already possess." And although the old man tried to persuade her with all the soft words he could think of, she would not tell him her secret. But he was a sly old man, and the thought of the bishop's wine gave him no rest. So night after night he went and hid in the old woman's cottage, in the hope that his wife and her friends would meet there. And although for a long time it was all in vain, at last his trouble was rewarded, for one evening the whole 5 old women assembled, and in low tones and with chuckles of laughter they recounted all that had befallen them in Lapland. And then, running to the fireplace, they one after another climbed on a chair and put their feet on the sooty crook. Then they repeated the magic words, and hey presto, they were up in the loom and away before the old man could draw his breath. I can do that too, he said to himself, and he crawled out of his hiding place and ran to the fire, and he put his foot on the crook and repeated the words, and up the chimney he went, and flew through the air and after his wife and her companions as if he'd been a warlock born. And as witches are not in the habit of looking over their shoulders, they never noticed that he was following them until they reached the bishop's palace and went down into his cellar. Then when they found that he was among them, they were not too well pleased. However, there was no help for it, and obviously he was not to be turned away, and they settled down to enjoy themselves. They tapped this cask of wine, and they tapped that, drinking a little of each, but not too much, for the women were cautious old folk, and they knew that if they wanted to get home before cock-crow, it behoved them to keep their heads at least a bit clear. But the old man was not so wise, for he sipped and he sipped, until at last he became quite drowsy, and lay down on the floor and fell fast asleep. Well, his wife, seeing this, thought she should teach him a lesson, not to be so curious in the future. So when she and her 4 friends thought it was time to be gone, she departed without waking him. Then he slept peacefully for some hours, until 2 of the bishop's servants, coming down to the cellar to draw wine for their master's table, almost fell over him in the darkness. Greatly astonished at his presence there, for the cellar door was fast locked, they dragged him up to the light, shook him and cuffed him, and asked him how he came to be there. And the poor old man was so confused at being awakened in this rough way, and his head seemed to whirl around so fast that all he could stammer out was, "I came from Fife, and I traveled on the midnight wind to get here." And as soon as they heard that, the men's servants cried out that he was a warlock, and they dragged him before the bishop. And as bishops in those days had a holy horror of warlocks and witches, he ordered him to be burned alive. When the sentence was pronounced, you may be very sure that the poor old man wished with all his heart that he'd stayed quietly at home in bed and never hankered after the bishop's wine. But it was too late to wish that now, for the servants dragged him out into the courtyard, put a chain round his waist, and fastened it to a great iron stake. They piled, and I've been over this before, I know my audience is smart enough to understand that this word is being used in the archaic way where it's about bundles of wood, but YouTube isn't that smart. So if I say it, it's going to kill the video in the algorithm, I'm sure. So they piled bundles of wood around his feet and set them alight. And as the first tiny little tongue of flame crept up, the poor old man thought that his last hour had come. But when he thought that, he forgot completely that his wife was a witch. For just as the little tongue of flame began to singe his breeches, there was a swish and flutter in the air, for a great gray bird with outstretched wings appeared in the sky and swooped down suddenly and perched for a moment on the old man's shoulder. And in this gray bird's mouth was a little red peony, which is like a woolen nightcap, usually striped. Which to everyone's amazement, it popped on the prisoner's head. And then it gave one fierce "Quack!" and flew away again, but to the old man's ears that croak was the sweetest music he'd ever heard. For to him it was the croak of no earthly bird, but the voice of his wife whispering words of magic to him. And when he heard them, he jumped for joy, for he knew they were words of deliverance. And he shouted them aloud, and the chains fell off, and he mounted in the air, up and up, while the onlookers watched him in awe-struck silence, he flew away, right away, to the kingdom of Fife, without as much as saying goodbye to them. And when he found himself once more safely home, you may be very sure he never tried to find out his wife's secrets again, but left her alone to her own devices. And that is the tale of the party witches who went to Norway to have a monster mash. Tomorrow, we have our varietal show on Thursday, but I actually don't really know what I'm gonna do there. Now that I think about it, yeah, Giese says, "Let all husbands take heed." I do really enjoy how a lot of the Scottish folklore is, I'm not gonna say egalitarian per se. Like, it still holds a lot of those what we would consider archaic standards to heart, but it's a lot more egalitarian than most of the folklore we read. Like, it is equally likely that a woman will save herself or kick some guy for being incompetent or whatever else. It's just a very fun story. Lizzie Rose says, "I love that story so much." Yes, absolutely. It's just so joyful in its conceit. It never really wastes your time. Yeah. Anyways, that is the last, like, really traditional folklore of Halloween stories that we're going to read this month. Like I said, next week, I will make a decision for what we're going to do with our longer stream. It's down between the two stories, the Arthur Conan Doyle and the Sheridan Le Fanu. We'll see which one I vibe with more, and feel like I can bring the best to. I'm hoping that those stories will be more like 2.5 hours than the 4.5 of the last one. I mean, they're half the word count, so I don't know. It depends on the pros, though. Sorry. My brain did the Etch-a-Sketch thing. Oh, yes. I do know what I'm doing on Halloween, though. It's more in the spirit of this last story. I did consider, I was like, I could do the spookiest, scariest things or whatever else. And traditionally, actually, the traditional thing that I used to do, I did for 2, maybe 3, but at least 2, was I used to do a choose your own adventure of like a horror house, and then we'd play it together. I would write it, put it into Twine, and we'd play it together. And I mentioned before, it just wasn't popular enough for how much work it involved. But I did like the feeling of it being more like a Halloween party than a particularly spooky thing. So the varietal show on the Thursday, which is not this coming Thursday, but the week after, it's going to be more like a Halloween party. I have found a game I want to play. It's very silly. And I imagine it will be very casual. The other thing I was going to say is I don't know what I'm doing for this Thursday. We'll see what I find. And next Tuesday, it will be our long stories. So we're almost done Halloween. And then I got to do the very difficult task of trying to find Christmas stories, which are way, way less common than scary ghost stories and folklore. So partially because Christmas was very much treated like Halloween in the past. So a lot of these stories even probably would be set around Christmas or it's read around Christmas. I made a episode of Fireside Fairytales about that called Christmas Ghost Stories, making that point. Okay. Giese says, don't watch comedies, Tammy. Abdominal surgeries hurt when you laugh. Yes. Also, good luck with your surgery, Tammy. Zombie Wolf has 2 random trivias, because they weren't here last week. The first one is John Carpenter's Halloween was filmed in 21 days. That makes sense. It was mostly people walking around a neighborhood. I mean, it was well shot and atmospheric, but it wasn't like a complicated set or anything. Part 2. There's a full moon on Halloween every 19 years. Nice. Is this one of those years? Probably not. All right. If I'm not on Thursday's stream, assume I died or met a terrible fate on the 30th, because that's the evening museum exhibit. I'm going to downtown alone. Is downtown scary where you live? Okay. Well, I had a lot of fun with this story, in particular at the end. I loved learning a bit about the Noonwraith, and I hope you guys enjoyed learning about it. It's one of the oddest spirits I've ever found. And as always, thank you so much, Lizzie Rose, for tuning in and participating in my amazement at the Noonwraith, and GS for agreeing that these stories were this year a little more intense than they have been in the previous years. And also, Tammy, I hope you feel better. And Jumpstore, I'm glad that I forgot to mention it in the stream, but I'm glad that your writing workshop went really well. And of course, Zombie Wolf, enjoy your time at the museum. Sounds fun. And if anybody is out there, if anyone is out there lurking, keep on lurking. We're happy to have you. Anyways, I will keep the fire going. You folks have yourself a good sleep.